Hello and welcome to our inaugural program at Pitchfork Radio. My name is Shelley Johnson and this is my new show. You may know of my 2-year run with Our Natural Rights, where we focused on education. And at this time, our new show focus is discussions of what can be done once we know about our current world situation to take action. Of course, we continue to learn and stay abreast of the new events. For instance, it's very important that we continue to get to the bottom of the Harney County, Oregon assassination of Lavoy Finicum. But now I believe that there is enough data available to anybody really interested in the condition the world is in, and I am urging people to take note of others who are action-oriented. Emulate them if you feel so inclined. Take your own steps towards self-responsibility and empowerment, and share what you are doing. Please bear with me as I work to become more accustomed to this new format. My first guest is world-renowned forecaster and economist Jim Willie, editor of the Hat Trick newsletter found on goldenjackass.com, and I'm sure he will have suggestions for us about what we can do with the information he is sharing. Welcome, Jim, and thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure being on your show. It's the inaugural, but hey, more power to you.
Thank you. Let me do a little bit of additional introduction for you. Jim Willie comes from U.S. industry with 3 main fields of statistics covered. He earned a PhD in statistics at Carnegie Mellon University in 1980. The 3 fields are quality control in manufacturing, marketing research in computer technology, and sales forecasting in retail. Since 2004, the Golden Jackass has been running the Hat Trick newsletter that focuses on gold, currencies, central banks, and the economies. His numerous correct forecasts on important developments toward the global breakdown have gained international attention, if not notoriety. The current major forecasts include the rejection of the U.S. dollar as global reserve, the installation of the Eurasian trade zone, the flipping east by Germany, Turkey, Saudi, and Japan, and the return of the gold standard. This return will come through the trade window, not the currency window. The acceleration of systemic breakdown events has come in earnest during the early months of 2015, exactly as he forecast. While the degraded and compromised economic profession has presided over ruin, the Jackass carries a near 90% correct forecast rate since systemic failure, criminal activity, and sustained pressures to maintain the broken system are integrated in the work. The Jackass prefers to say, "My work is unencumbered by the limitations of economic credentials." So, I think the subject matter we're going to be speaking of is quite crucial because the economy underlies all of the other chaos that we're seeing. And of course, it's the agenda of the global elite shadow government, which wants everything and would just prefer to have us out of the way for sure. So, since it's Monday, let's begin with an assessment of where we are at the beginning of this week, February 1st, 2016. And I'm going to turn it over to you from there.
What do you mean, where are we now? I don't know.
Okay, economically, as far as what we're looking at gas prices continuing to drop. We're looking at all kinds of, zero hedge, new forecast, and this kind of thing. So what I would just like to do is identify where we are in this breakdown process of the global economy. And with anything that's particularly current, I guess. Let's start there.
Okay. Let me try with a generality, and I'll move toward the specifics.
Okay.
We have a gigantic trick involved. It's like a fake meter that people are focused on and fixated on, and it is the high dollar value, the high dollar exchange rate. And U.S. government officials are saying that it's because the U.S. economy is stronger than the rest.
Okay.
And that is so false. Since 1971, or basically 73, what has been the foundation basis for the dollar? Crude oil.
Right, crude oil, yep.
How's the crude oil price doing?
Not so good.
70 days Therefore, one could say the dollar is dying, evidence being the collapse of its foundation.
Right.
So as the dollar as the crude oil price goes down, we see the dollar going up. Why is that? It's because of vast trillion-dollar liquidations of petrodollar contra derivatives. It's also from enormous margin calls on dollar debt, like with third world nations and emerging market nations. Mm-hmm. So the crude oil price is going down, and it flips up the dollar value, as you see it in the dollar index, the DX index. I call it the US DX index. What is that measured against? Well, major currencies and a lot of minor currencies. Okay, so minor currencies are going to hell. Therefore, the dollar is going up in its exchange rate.
Okay.
It's not a good thing.
No.
So as the dollar goes in its supposed valuation, you're seeing gold knock down.
Right.
Again, from paper derivatives. So the paper derivative contracts, Shelley, this is the real status of today. The paper derivatives that rule the petrodollar, in other words, connection between crude oil and major currencies, specifically the dollar, and the other major derivative contracts that link the dollar with gold and silver, they're all in fast work, knocking down gold, keeping crude oil down also. And like a teeter-totter, I'm still struggling to find the right word for teeter-totter in Spanish, because it's a great explanation. The big bully, the big fat boy, is on one side, and the little kid, the little girl that doesn't weigh a lot, mm-hmm. they get launched upward.
Right. Okay,
you're having the crude oil price pushed down, and the going up. It's wrecking the U.S. economy, while QE, monetary policy for the Federal Reserve, which manages the dollar, the monetary policy with QE is wrecking capital around the world. So the dollar is wrecking the economy, while QE is wrecking capital within the economy, and you're having a global depression hit. We're way past saying that we're in a global recession.
Oh, yeah.
You got about 70% decline in shipping.
Yes.
You've got vast declines in freight and shipping and railways and electricity usage. So when they say that the U.S. economy is still in a sluggish recovery, that's a statement by almost law, quasi law. Mm-hmm. How are you going to qualify the recovery? Because we're in a recovery, you can't say otherwise. Well, it looks like we're in a sluggish. I call it a comatose recovery because it's almost dead.
Yes.
We've lost the concept in the U.S. of what money is. When I said that to my father, I got a snicker. My father's an educated literature. He's got a PhD in literature. And I said, Dad, this 2 years ago, I said, Dad, the country's lost its concept of money. Mm-hmm. I don't think the people in the United States know what money is anymore. And he said, well, Jim, what an arrogant, silly thing to say. It's what you have in wallet. And I said, no, Dad, that's legal tender. Wow. And he said, well, what's the difference? I said, that's exactly my point. You don't know what money is, but don't worry. You're among 300 million others who don't know what it is either. Yeah. And then he challenged me to define what money was. I said, sure, it's fungible. It's got to be exchangeable from one party to another. It's got to be permanent. You could have it buried at sea for 120 years. You pick it up and just clean it off and it's good as new. You can't make it except in a mine. Like alchemy is no good. Said electronic money as we've got it has led to stupidity like for helicopter drops of $10,000 per household to get out of this economic mess, and that's not a solution. No, not at all. So we've lost our concept of money. We've lost our concept of capital. Remember, we were elected in 2008 to serve in 2009 to start creating jobs.
Right.
That's pretty hard to do when you don't know what capital is.
Exactly right.
There wasn't a tremendous movement for assisting small business, the dynamic engine of the American miracle. No, instead it's how do we get money in consumers' pockets?
Exactly.
That's a moron economic viewpoint and derivative.
Well,
and that's
sure.
what we've got. A bunch of morons, Shelley. A bunch of morons running the economic policy and the monetary policy. And now the Fed is cornered.
Yep.
So here we are.
Well, you know, we live on this debt-based economy, so of course they're going to push consumerism and call it whatever else they want to call it, but they thrive on the debt. That's how they've been able to do to us what they're doing to us.
Well, yeah, but remember back in 1984, Intel announced, well, you don't, but I do because I was working with a computer company at the time, and it was such big news. It went across Digital Equipment Corporation in Maynard, Massachusetts, like a storm. Intel was outsourcing to the Pacific Rim and exiting California laboratories in what they call a low-cost solution. What I've come to learn in the last several years is that the low-cost solution, outsourcing of U.S. industry for cheaper costs, was a Rockefeller concept out of the Rockefeller Foundation that caught a lot of good traction.
Yeah.
Good traction, I mean effective traction, not positive or productive.
Sure.
So I started reading Barron's back then in the late 80s, and the Wall Street Journal was sitting on my boss's desk, so that was easy to pick up during lunchtime just to walk off into the woods, have a lunch, or find a park bench. I did that a lot, but what I started reading about in Barron's was the stupidity of outsourcing. And I thought, way back in the late 80s, this is no good. You can't take your legitimate industry and send it to another country and expect to have legitimate income.
Right.
What are you going to do for income? And then the answer came quickly with the Greenspan. We're going to become a financial engine. We're going to have a financial center to our economy. We're going to be services and finance. And I thought, no way, it's just going to be a bunch of asset bubbles. And that's exactly what it was.
Of course.
So
and his
outsourcing industry was the beginning of the end of the U.S. economy.
Right. And Greenspan knew when he said that who he was going to direct the flow directly towards. Of course, it was his bosses. So
well, sure. And then in 2001, he urged the whole country to go out and loans against the home equity and refinance mortgages.
Yep.
Why did he do that? Because he didn't want to have a natural housing market recession because it might have crippled the entire nation following the tech telecom climax asset bubble.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, what we got in 2007 was a subprime bond market bust, which I view as a double recession. The first recession should have been 2001. We're going down the wrong path after making gigantic macroeconomic errors.
Yes.
And I paid close attention to the differences between macroeconomics and microeconomics. It's kind of a clever little bind to say I'm unencumbered by the limitations of economic credentials. That's a very power-packed, dense comment in my bio. It means that I was not badly educated in economics. It means that I was not spoon-fed the wonders of Keynesian debt-based economic policy. I'm a student of von Mises' Austrian School of Economics, sound money.
Right.
The U.S. dollar has a foundation now. You could say that it's a foundation of oil, but it's really more like a tarmac oil, whereas the basis is the U.S. Treasury bond. We issue more Treasury bonds now, and they're not backed by oil anymore. They're backed by more bonds that are backed by more derivatives and that are backed by carry trades and more bonds and derivatives, and more bonds and more bonds and more bonds. And we do print money.
Right.
We just print money like Zimbabwe, Shelley.
Yes, we do, and it's all just based upon fresh air and mountain scenery and the full faith and credit of people who think that it has any value.
Yeah, well, we're now seeing a global rejection. This was a 2014 forecast of mine. Look for a multi-year process for global rejection of the dollar.
Yeah.
And I think the QE sequence, quantitative easing, for those who are not familiar, what it means is hypermonetary inflation, printing money without sterilizing the printing and injection. By that, I mean you print money and put it in the system without removing other money in the banking system that would be sterilized. So we're doing unsterilized, like Zimbabwe.
Yeah,
okay, I'd like
exactly.
to just quickly run through the QE sequence.
Okay.
We had QE, which was the monetary easing, in other words, printing money to cover the U.S. government debt and to redeem toxic mortgage bonds. That's exactly what like Zimbabwe would do.
Yeah.
Okay, that was QE, and that was in 2012, and that was 1 year after I forecasted that it would happen. I said that in early 2011. I said that in late 2010. I also got right the 0% interest. I said back when Lehman hit, we're going to go to 0% just a matter of months because it's absolute urgency. I had another critical forecast. I mean, I got a lot of big forecasts that I got right. I do make some errors. I'm fully willing to spend 5 minutes on my errors. But back in 2007, I got into a disagreement with a very well-heeled and established German corporation CEO. And he said to me, the Euro Central Bank will never follow the U.S. down to 0%. And I said, sure they will. As soon as the euro goes up, after you do the right thing, you'll do the right thing and then you'll do the wrong thing to save your export trade. And he said, I don't think so. Well, that's exactly what happened a year later. I earned his respect, which was fine, and I had to be delicate about it because he's in his 80s. You know, you don't take a German older like that, career resume, a corporate head of a multinational corporation, and say, you don't do that. So I didn't. And our liaison managed our relationship and differences pretty well. But, okay, back to QE. Here is the sequence of QE. And it's ugly and it's bigger than what we've been told. Okay, in I think it was about 2013, we had QE3. Mm-hmm. I think 2012, sorry. We had Operation Twist. Bernanke called it Operation Twist. I call it QE3 because in their initiative to move from a long-term treasury, 5-year, and 30-year, and go to the short-term, for months, 1 year, 2 year. The Chinese went to short-term. I hear it went entirely to 2 year and under on the bond maturities. That was QE3 because it involves some extra cash in order to facilitate that. Then we had QE4, happened about a year later, and they called that QE3.
Interesting. And
then later in 2013, we had taper talk. That wasn't a QE event, but it was certainly surrounding. It was the cloud cover over QE. They said that they were going to raise the rates. I called them liars, and it was proven correct again. Then something happened that was very well hidden. I call it QE5. Back in late 2012, the Fed decided that it would be wise to create a new group of, I call them Fed outposts. It was Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, and Switzerland, and it's called the BLIC. Whenever I hear BLICs, I think of bling, something sexual. It's BLICs. It's not bricks. I wish it were bling, but it's not bling. It's BLICs. B-L-I-C-S. What is a BLICs? Well, from June 2012 to the end of 2.5 years, to the end of 2014, the BRICS nations took Fed money and bought treasury bonds for their own central bank that equaled $420 billion worth of bonds, exactly what the Fed had bought. So in other words, the Fed doubled their QE by making export outposts. I call that QE5.
Okay.
We've had QE6 that happened at 2014. I remember like yesterday because I remember the office whose window I looked out of thinking about these things. That's how I date things in Costa Rica. What window did I look out of? But what we did, the U.S. did in late 2000, was October 2014, was to give orders, mandate the Japanese government that we were taking their $1.2 trillion government pension fund and we're going to convert it to treasury bonds. And at the same time, give full-bore permission to the Bank of Japan, their central bank, to go to what they called, not me, they called unlimited QE.
Wow.
So they printed money and immediately we have to make a new forecast that watched the Japanese, again, it's fall 20%, and that's exactly what it did in the next several months. These are easy calls when you pay attention to the important things, which is marketing research is all about. So we stole or commandeered, confiscated $1.2 trillion worth of Japanese pension funds, which they replaced promptly by printing new yen.
Yep.
And, you know, part of the Japanese mindset then was, well, we'll do what the Americans want because they kill our people. That's exactly what we do. We kill bankers quietly.
Yes.
We hire the Yakuza in Japan to murder their bankers to keep them in line. That's exactly what we've been doing for 2 generations.
Wow.
But they also had something else in mind. Well, bring down the Japanese yen, we'll be able to compete more successfully against our new Chinese rivals.
Right, right.
Okay, so that was QE6. QE7 just happened last month, or
in December. Right.
The fake Fed hike. Now, should we get into that, or did you want to, go up to that in another way? Because this is a very important monetary policy decision with mass curveballs in there. I think fool 95% of the people or more. Probably.
Jim, I'm going to pause this recording for a minute because you're starting to break down, and what I'd like to do is reinitiate the call, if that works for you.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, we're back with Jim Willie again, and I'd like to concentrate for a little while on the latest Fed hike that took place in December.
Okay, this was probably the most important monetary decision that we've had since Lehman. And I think it is designed to ward off a macro systemic Lehman event. By that I mean the Lehman event was certainly big, and it certainly affected the world. But it didn't affect the entire bond market nor the entire currency market. What it did was it affected the entire housing and mortgage market and the banking sector related to that. Mm-hmm. It caused the nationalization of Fannie Mae, the nationalization of AIG, and the failure, more like a murder, of Lehman. Lehman didn't just die from insolvency. Lehman was suffocated by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, who refused to pay them on all their bond sales and all their asset sales for a period of 2 weeks. And it's kind of like saying, well, my baby died, it just stopped breathing. But no, you had a plastic bag over its head, Mama.
Exactly.
Okay?
Holy
That's
smoke.
the Lehman Brothers.
Okay.
They did not get any payments for any mortgage bonds, any derivatives, any collateralized bonds, any asset period from JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, the biggest players.
Wow.
Okay, so that was the Lehman murder. And that came about 7 months after the Bear Stearns murder.
Mm-hmm.
Bear Stearns was different. They were long gold and short the dollar. So that just did not sit well with the masters of the Wall Street universe.
Yeah.
So they killed Bear Stearns. And the story is not told that way. I mean, they even had a movie, The Big Short, where they showed Bear Stearns, in really bad situation with respect to their mortgage bonds. Mm-hmm. That wasn't it. They were just singled out and killed for their position that was long gold.
Wow.
And short the dollar. Okay, so we had a big event. And I actually got this forecast wrong. I was saying in October and November, no, they're not going to do a Fed rate hike. They can't. Because if they do a rate hike, it would kill off the Wall Street bond carry trade. And by that I mean their leveraged arbitrage of borrowing the 0% and investing in the 10-year bond, pocketing the 2% difference, the spread, and multiplying it by 25 or 30 for the leverage on the futures contract. So it's 50 to 60% gain per year off free money that they can borrow that you cannot.
Right.
Okay, that's the bond carry trade. And there's something even bigger than the Wall Street bond carry trade, which, by the way, Bernanke fully endorsed and encouraged. He said, you need to start doing some leverage trades and build up the assets and reserves for your banks.
Wow.
Not commercial lending to the economy. So the fascist business model has involved the U.S. banks becoming more a casino rather than a commercial lending. That's why there's no money being lent to the economy. Okay, so anyway, back to the reasons why they could not raise rates. The second one was more important. You're having all kinds of countries around the world not buying any treasury bonds. They're not buying the securitized bonds that put into form the traded form, the government debt for the United States. Well, then where's the buying coming from?
Exactly.
It's coming from the derivatives. It's coming from the interest rate swaps. And, Rob Kirby occasionally brings me up to speed on that. It's a very difficult concept, but what you've got is a swap on the short end. Just think of the 3-month Treasury. And you've got a swap on the long end. Just think of the 10-year Treasury. It's a swap of the bond versus the cash coupon bond. It gets very messy. But if you want to think of it more simply, think of it as free money comes in, low cost, 0% money comes in that they short against the Fed funds rate or the 3-month Treasury bill. So they short that, and with leverage, here we're talking 50 to 1 or 100 to 1, they're coming in and producing demand for the 10-year Treasury. Where did it come from? The borrowed 0% money with leverage and the machinery at work within the interest rate swap machinery, the contract. And what indication do we have from past events that is indeed a mechanism at work? It was the London whale, Bruno Ixel, working in London for JP Morgan, where they had an accident. And they claimed that it was, maybe a $100 million loss. I came out after the voice tipped me off. He said, no, it's going to be right around 10 billion admitted, but reality 100 billion lost, which
Wow.
JP Morgan could never admit because that's really on the order of their whole capitalization. Mm-hmm. So true to form, 2 months later, Ixel was thrown under the bus. And we learned that it was more like about $2 billion. And now the final figure is $8.9 billion, which is close to the 10 that I said on day 3 of the Bruno Ixel London Whale event. Okay, so I figured that they weren't going to, the Fed was not going to sabotage Wall Street Bank's carry trade, and they weren't going to sabotage JP Morgan and their exchange stabilization fund at work with the interest rate swap derivatives that produce all the artificial demand for treasury bonds. And if you want to get a really good look at some of the origins of this, take a look at the second half 2010 Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and look at the data for the Wall Street banks on their derivatives. It was $8.5 trillion for Morgan Stanley all by itself.
Wow.
And we were told by Bernanke that there was this great global rush into treasury bonds. No, there wasn't. There was a great rush to fund the interest rate swap derivative machinery that produced the demand with not a single buyer behind them, and that's where you get these failures to deliver. That's evidence of it. All right, so I thought they weren't going to sabotage the bond carry trade, weren't going to sabotage the interest rate swap machinery. What I did not expect was that they were going to do a Fed rate hike with no increase in the interest rate.
Okay.
It was a fake rate hike.
Yep.
So we looked at, my group looked at what is the effective Fed funds rate. Well, a week later, it only budged 8 basis points. There wasn't any 25. And then for a while, it was 15 and 20 basis points, and then it went back down. And now you're starting to see, I mean, shortly after January kicked in and everybody gets back to work, you started hearing what they call the Fed backtracking. Looks like the economy is really not quite as strong as we thought it was, in order to justify their not imposing the full 25 basis point. What they did, though, in the meantime, Shelley, was something that was clever. They told us that they were going to be amplifying the reverse repo window.
Okay, that's gobbledygook. What does that mean?
Well, it's not gobbledygook. It's just difficult to understand.
Right.
And I got it a little backwards. I was thinking that since they had $40 billion a day in failures to deliver on treasury bond sales and an equal volume in the reverse repo window, I figured that back in September and October they were doing $1 trillion a month of hidden QE. Well, they were, but not for the reasons and the way I laid it out. The reverse repo actually sucks cash from the big banks, like Wall Street banks, and gives them treasury bonds. And look at it this way. A big bank like Citigroup is in much better position to leverage their whole financial position off treasury bonds a whole lot better than they could with cash. So what they did was using the reverse repo window. They gave us the information. But most people, like yourself, is not an insult, didn't know what it meant.
Right.
So I did some research. I talked with Rob Kirby. I talked with Euro Raj. I talked with a couple of others. And I learned what they did was they made the Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel, whatever you want to call it. They made it higher and they made it narrower. So now the Treasury bond tower is more unstable as a result of what I call QE7 that happened in December of 2015, 2 months ago. That's QE7. What they did was they gave away the reverse repo. They talked a little bit about national security, and they hinted that the Fed and its cohorts were matching the dumped treasury bonds by our creditors. Now, here's a piece of information that makes it a lot clearer. China was turned down on its International Monetary Fund inclusion into their currency basket. They call it the special drawing rights, the SDR.
Right.
And that includes the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the pound. And now it's going to include, in a few months, It's going to include, well, I prefer calling it the RMB because when you say yuan, I mispronounce it. It's yuan. I've got Chinese clients who say, Jim, it's yuan. Okay, well, why do all the Asian currencies sound the same? There's the Japanese yen, Y-E-N. There's the Korean won, W-O-N. And there's the Chinese yuan, Y-U-A-N. So I prefer to call it the renminbi, RMB. Okay, so the Chinese were really pissed off at a broken promise, or maybe not so much a broken promise as all the different requirements weren't met and weren't properly explained. So the Chinese went off in August, September, and October last year and sold $250 billion worth of Treasury bonds.
Oh, my.
Why didn't the bond yield go up on the 10-year? Because the Department of Treasury is now the double barrel, the second barrel of QE. It's the Department of Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. They bought it all.
Yep.
In order to maintain national security and stabilization of the Treasury bond. Okay.
So this goes way beyond the plunge protection team, really.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the plunge protection team kind of has Uncle Charlie as the Exchange Stabilization Fund.
Gotcha.
If they ever can't manage something, okay, let's bring in Uncle Charlie, and the ESF will ride in for the rescue. So what we have now is a fake Fed hike in December with no real big increase, no notable increase in the effective Fed funds rate, which preserves the bond carry trade for Wall Street banks, which preserves the interest rate swap machinery and all that structural support for the Treasury bond. So, we're not seeing a rate hike. We are seeing a second barrel to what I call infinite QE.
Yeah.
Whatever is needed to print money to cover these Treasury bonds, they will do so. And now, for national security reasons, that's how important it's gotten, we're using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, ESF, out of the Department of Treasury. So what was the Fed hike? What was the announced initiative? What was the decision in December? To employ the ESF from the Department of Treasury in unlimited fashion. So now we have two chambers printing money like Zimbabwe.
Ugh.
This is not going to end well. It's going to end up in a global rejection of the dollar. When they went to QE, Russia and China and all the BRICS nations, there are 114 BRICS alliance nations. I think they all signed a pact that they were going to abandon the dollar. Why would they want to hold their savings accounts, otherwise known as Forex reserves, in the form of Treasury bonds in such high proportions when the Fed is engaged in monetary policy like Zimbabwe?
Exactly.
So that's why the dollar is going to go away. And that's what the reset is, Shelley.
Mm-hmm.
The reset is to bring sanity back to the world in the financial structure.
Mm-hmm. At the discomfort and peril of those of us who are pegged via where we live to the U.S. dollar.
Yes, but you may be pegged where you live. Your roots might be, in a certain state of the union, but it doesn't mean that you're forbidden from owning something that's going to survive and thrive.
Exactly.
In the reset. When I first learned about the reset a little over a year ago, actually it was more than a year ago, I learned that the U.S. made a deal. We signed on with the global powers. In December of 2013, we agreed to the terms of the reset, and then we broke them all and had a Ukraine war in February of 14 instead.
Mm-hmm.
The Ukraine war was a violation of a global, call it a treaty if you will, between nations. we thought, no, wait a minute. We can just invade Ukraine, block the Russian link with Europe, and steal 33 tons of gold. And that's going to buy us some time.
Sure. Ah, what an incestuous mess this is.
We can't get out of this because we refuse to do what's necessary. And that is to go to the gold standard in numerous fronts and to liquidate the big banks.
Right, exactly
right. We
right.
refuse to do those two things. So when people say, what is your basis of a solution? I say, go to the gold standard and liquidate the big banks. Well, we can't do that. I said, then we will not have a solution.
Exactly, because that's really the only solution, like you just said. Now,
well, the third piece, too, I like to include it. It's not even a dangling item. End these wars to defend the dollar.
Precisely. So when you say the return to the gold standard will come through the trade window, not the currency window, can you explain that, please?
Yeah, when you say to someone, what do you understand the gold standard to mean? They think most will come back and say, well, you have a currency and it's backed, redeemable by gold. Well, yeah, that's one. That's one element, and that's certainly a viable, important element. But there are three areas where gold can make an impact in the world financial structure and bring about stability to remove and correct the grotesque imbalances that we have now. I mean, does anybody think it's normal that the United States has a $500 billion annual trade deficit?
It's normal because that's what we've become accustomed to. Is it right? Of course not.
Well, by normal, I mean sustainable and legitimate.
Of course not.
It's customary, but not normal.
Okay.
Maybe that's a better way of... Okay, we've got a $40 billion a month trade deficit. Is something wrong there? Yeah, of course something's wrong there. So what the U.S. economy does, as a result of the outsourcing and stressed emphasis of the financial sector, we lost our industry.
Yeah.
Our critical mass of the industry is not there. That's why going to 0% didn't mean a hill of beans. I said this back in 2009 and 10. My brother, who's got an economics degree, said, Jim, we're going to 0%. That's always worked. And I said, not anymore. We've shedded our industrial base.
Right.
And the outsourcing has gone to a new level since 2001. Did you not notice the Chinese most favored nation status? John? My brother. And he said, yeah, but I said, yeah, but you're wrong. And that's why you're wrong, because it's not a small element to the picture. So we're really going to hell in a handbasket. Okay, the three pieces. You got to go to the weakest link. The three pieces are trade, banks, and currencies.
Okay.
What's the strongest link in there? Not in terms of viability, but the firmest grip of corrupt control. It's the currency.
It has to be, yes.
It's the bonds, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, Department of Treasury. It's the Fed printing money, covering bad debts. They did not want to have Wall Street banks go down. Okay, so what's the loosest grip on the dollar? It's trade.
Trade, yes.
The U.S. has a trade deficit, which means the production and industrial output is over 50% now in foreign countries.
Okay.
So the weak link is, what will the United States pay for a ship full of stuff? And I don't care whether it's oil or cement or containers holding television sets and stereos. I don't care. It's ships carrying stuff. And here's a statistic that'll blow your mind. The United States had an export from Los Angeles, Long Beach, a couple of other ports on the West Coast, plus New York and New Jersey and a couple other ports on the East Coast, the United States exported 400,000 containers last year that were empty.
Oh, my word.
So now we're not just exporting toxic bonds and diabetes.
Yeah.
That's a nasty joke. Fast food and diabetes. We're exporting toxic bonds, diabetes, and stinky air in containers that are empty.
Unbelievable.
Okay.
The illusion is just mind-boggling of all of this.
Well, I try to put in some data in here so you can, grab onto it.
Okay.
So now, as the United States imports all this stuff before we export the empty containers for another round trip, the foreign nations are given what as payment? Treasury bills.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want them anymore. They don't want them anymore.
Well, they might as well be paid in toilet paper.
They are paid in toilet paper. It's called Treasury bills.
Yep.
When they're printing them with QE and the double barrel in the Department of Treasury, that is toilet paper. We accuse Zimbabwe of turning their money into toilet paper with trillion-dollar bills that you put in your wallet. And we're not really any different except for the number on the bill.
Yeah.
We do it in volume rather than on the individual bill. So, foreign nations now are starting to say, we don't want the treasury bills anymore. Why? Because you're printing them like Zimbabwe to cover your national debt, and nobody's covering your national debt anymore. You're running your Washington federal deficits like Zimbabwe. I love Zimbabwe because when you say it, you can emphasize those B's. Zimbabwe. Okay, that's better than saying like Sierra Leone. Okay, no, it's like Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe got a horrible reputation for what they did to the Zim dollar.
Yeah. And
we're doing the same thing. So, nations of the world, led by the BRICS and their alliance of nations. We're talking about 114 nations, and the list is growing all the time. And you're not going to read in the New York Times what member nations are on the BRICS alliance because it's a story they don't want you to know about.
Of course.
It's not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. By the way, Brazil is a basket case right now.
Yes.
Their currency has gone down by a factor of 80% in the last 20 years. So they're a real basket case, and look to see if they can pull off the Summer Olympics. All right, back to the foreign nations who don't want the treasury bills anymore. What do they want instead? They're starting to band together and say, we want gold trade notes written up as contracts for letters of credit. And if you don't post the gold collateral for the gold trade note, you can't buy our shipment. And that is one reason, it's not the only reason, it is one reason you're having a shipping slowdown right now, because part of the shipping slowdown is ships sitting at port telling the Americans, we don't want your stinking treasury bills anymore.
Right.
So they're not leaving port on the other side where the manufacturing is done. And that's why these BRICS nations are starting to grow a pair and tell people at their conferences that we represent X billion dollars, X percent of the global economy, and we have X percent of the global Forex reserve. They're starting to flex their muscles, realizing that they are the beneficiary of these 30 years of outsourcing from the United States and the West. Take a look at Spain. I got a friend who goes to Barcelona. He loves going there almost once a year. And he said, Jim, all the shop owners are aghast. There's no more Spanish industry.
Wow.
They're broken. Okay, so the weak link, Shelley, is trade. Payment for trade. The gold trade note will be that vehicle it acts like a letter of credit. Right now, the letter of credit is backed by posting Treasury bills. They don't want them anymore because they don't want to hold them when they don't offer any interest rate. And by the way, I left out a fact regarding the fake Fed hike.
Okay.
We have an inversion now. The Fed funds is now inverted with respect to the 3-month Treasury bill. This should not be. Okay? And it will not be, and it exposes the fraud. And as it gets uninverted, you're going to see that they didn't do any rate hike. And they're going to reverse it. So after they reverse the rate hike, Shelley, what are you left with? The double-barreled ESF, extra barrel for printing money like Zimbabwe to cover all the debts like China dumped $250 billion in August, September, October.
Right.
Okay, so the weakest link is trade to go back to the gold standard. And the gold standard, it's kind of a fuzzy concept, a gold trade note. What's a gold trade note? Well, it's a letter of credit that's good for 90 days. That's usually the length of time for a shipment to arrive. And it's backed up by a gold deposit. It's the margin posted.
Okay.
If you're like Walmart and you're buying stuff from China, you don't put up the entire amount of the purchase. You put up, 10, 15, 20%, and that means you're good for the rest, and you're liable to lose that if you renege.
Right.
The gold trade note works in the same way as the letters of credit, and I believe the BRICS Development Bank, New Development Bank, NDB it's being called, is going to be, I think, the gold central bank that holds the collateral, which is purchased for the gold trade notes. Okay, so what's the second thing? If the nations of the world that produce things are paid in gold trade notes, what's the next step toward the progression in the gold standard being implemented? I think it's going to be that banks recapitalize themselves by putting in gold reserves. In other words, they start getting out of the Treasury bonds and the Euro bonds, and to some extent the Japanese bonds and the British gilts, but primarily the Treasury bonds. And some nations, like in Europe and in the Middle East, they have quite a slug of Euro bonds. Well, they're going to get rid of a lot of them and put in gold right before it goes up double or triple.
Wow.
That's how they recapitalize the banks, because they're going to do it before they let China lift the price of gold and silver. And I'm told it's not just gold, it's gold and silver. We're going to be going back to a bimetallic monetary system, and don't be at all surprised if it goes back to the post-Civil War 16-to-1 ratio. I'm told that they've got a goal of about 25-to-1. And right now it's something totally absurd, like 50 or 60. Okay. Totally absurd. I like to say that if you're going to invest mostly in silver, because you're going to get triple the gain that you would have gold. Okay, so as the banking systems of the world diversify out of Western sovereign bonds, primarily the Treasury bond and the Euro bond, they're going to want something better that's going to rise in value, and gold is precisely that. They're suddenly going to be recapitalized only if they put in a lot of gold. Right. So big demand is going to come sometime soon for central banks and the banking systems across numerous countries in the world. Wow. It can only happen if they double or triple the price, release a lot of tightly held gold. If you're holding a bunch of gold now, I guarantee you, most of the people would say, I'm not selling it at $1,100 an ounce. It's a fake price. So they don't sell it. But if suddenly it's $2,500, they might sell a portion. And that's how the banks will find some available supply. And what's the last piece? The currencies.
Yes.
I think China is going to do something very clever. The Voice has been hinting this. Sometimes he's a pretty slick fellow. He's extremely bright, and sometimes he loses his patience with the jackass. But come back, and I just try to soothe his soothe his nerves or, massage his trampled feet, something I've done. I do a lot of things that some of them upset him, but lately it's just too much chatter among some of us in our emails, and some of it's not important comments, so we're going to leave him out of certain conversations, but include him on the important ones. But what is coming is that there's going to be a number of different currencies that are going to be gold-backed. And I think the first one that he's been a little slick in describing, I think we're going to see a gold-backed Chinese RMB.
Okay.
And it's going to come about perhaps in a transition mode. And how I like to describe it is the gold trade note might have a transition, a caretaker, if you will,
okay,
in the Chinese RMB. In other words, the Chinese RMB is going to have a short-term bond, like their equivalent of a treasury bill for 3 months.
Okay.
They might have a 3-month Chinese government bond with a gold backing, and that'll be interchangeable with the gold trade note.
Oh, okay.
And that could be the first global gold currency. And shortly after that, I think you're going to see the Russian ruble become gold-backed, and it's going to jump in value. And then you're going to see something that I've been calling, and the Voice has been calling, the gold-backed Nordic euro. Take a look at the strong European nations, and if you were going to do a clever cluster analysis or an analysis of variance on factor importance, you would find that the most important factor for European nations being solvent and strong is whether they're Catholic or not.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Italy, Spain, Portugal, basket cases.
Okay.
Germany, Austria, Netherlands, strong.
That's very
Where
interesting.
did Martin Luther come from? Germany.
Yes.
Okay, so the work ethic, the Protestant work ethic, that is not like a fictional term. In Italy, it's privilege. It's, my family owns a business. I don't have to work.
Mm-hmm.
In Spain, it's, we got a big housing bubble. I don't need to work. Okay, it's a lot more complicated than that, but you get the idea. The Catholic nations of Europe are in tatters.
Wow.
They dragged down Germany. They sucked $2 trillion of German savings since the European Monetary Union came into being in 1999. Germany doesn't want to finance the basket case pigs nations anymore, but they're kind of forced to. So you're going to see, I think, the Germans coming up with basically a gold-backed mark.
Nice.
The Deutschmark is going to come back. It's going to be gold-backed, and Austria and Netherlands will be using it. Okay, I have a kind of a corollary, a very important gold standard corollary. Unless you have a significant critical mass, your new gold-backed currency system will fail from its own success in a rising currency. By that I mean, suppose you only have a few countries that install a gold-backed currency, and 80% of the world does not use it. Well, that gold-backed currency is going to go up in value like double in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
It's gold-backed as opposed to a debt piece of garbage.
Sure.
The export trade will vanish in all the countries that impose the new gold standard because they can't export anything anymore. Their prices went through the roof.
Yes.
Their currency doubled. But if you've got something like the BRICS alliance of 114 nations, you can say, okay, all the nations of the world except France, England, the United States, you're in. England and the United States, you're out. So your currency is going to go down while ours is going to go up, and we won't care because we're 88% of the world.
Yeah.
Or 79% of the world. By the way, half of the U.S. economy, GDP, is mucky muck. We're not a 14 or 15 trillion dollar economy. We're half that because we count shuffling around mutual funds and debt pieces of paper. We call that economic activity.
Right.
Our financial sector with all that financial engineering that doesn't do jack shit in producing jobs or adding value. So the corollary to the gold standard calls for a strong critical mass to come forward simultaneously with gold currencies. Mm-hmm. Don't be surprised if Australia produces a gold currency. Don't be surprised if Latin America bends around, say, Panama, which already has sufficient gold for a gold-backed currency. They had a name for it. They called it the Central American dollar. They were ready in 2012, but the U.S. saw fit to bring about, how shall I say, an unexpected death of Chavez.
Oh, my gosh.
So the Chavez death, the Central American gold-backed dollar. I've gotten information on what exactly Panama holds. It's 80 million pounds of copper, and it's an equivalent of Fort Knox times 4.
Wow.
They've got it, and they had Venezuela and Ecuador on board, but Ecuador was pressured. I'm thinking it was probably through assassination threats. Mm-hmm. They sold their gold to Goldman Sachs. A lease, trade, whatever you want to call it. I call it blackmail sale. So now Venezuela is not on board, neither is Ecuador, and Panama is all by its lonesome. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to say, when all this shitstorm hits, they're going to say, we got a good boat here, but we need partners.
Right.
And you're going to see Brazil and Argentina sign on, and all the rest will too. So I think Latin America, which includes Central America, I don't know what's going to happen with Costa Rica here. That's a different story, and I usually prefer not to discuss the foibles of the country I'm living in.
That's probably smart.
Because I have a weird little story of a guy who had a newsletter in Nicaragua. And he was talking about how the Sandinistas were doing this and that, and Ortega and his gang were basically appropriating and stealing businesses and doing a lot of weird stuff. And suddenly the guy's girlfriend was murdered. The newsletter writer's girlfriend was murdered.
Right.
They framed him, put him in prison. 9 months later, he made a deal. I will give you people $300,000, and I will bring an end to my newsletter, and I'll leave Nicaragua, but I will also get out of prison.
Sounds about the way they work, definitely.
So it's not a good idea, but I will say this. The countries that sign on closely to the U.S. government and the Treasury Department and integrate the dollar closely with all of their pegging of currencies often put to use narcotics money laundering funds to support the currencies.
Right.
And they're not going to be prepared for the other side when they need to come up with a gold currency. So I don't know what Costa Rica is going to do. I hope they eventually see the wisdom of what's going on in Panama and the movement there. But if Latin America signs on, Central Europe signs on, Russia, China sign on, South Africa comes up with a gold-backed currency, Australia gold-backed currency, Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia, they all join in with something that's viable, you're going to see a critical mass of at least 80%. And that's how the gold-backed currencies come in.
Right. Through sheer intimidation and force, essentially.
Yeah, but also practicality, because the falling oil price is going to start killing banks real soon.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of nations are going to say, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And the answer is, we need to lift the gold price after you buy a lot of tonnage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the global motivation for the critical mass for seeing a doubled and tripled gold price. And that's how you get to 2,500 and 3,000. And the rest of the way up to, say, 15,000, that comes in steps.
Okay.
Not sure we're prepared to talk about that, but after they double and triple the gold price, you've got to reopen the gold mines. Now, here's a funny little factoid, Shelley. The Rand refinery, that's in South Africa,
mm-hmm.
has tripled output in the last couple of years. And during this time, when it's tripled its refinery output, the South African mines are down 60% or more in output.
Wow.
So how come the big national refinery has tripled when the whole country's mining is shutting down slowly but gradually and effectively, where their output is down 60%? The answer? Congo.
There you go.
Zambia, sorry.
Yeah.
Zimbabwe, Botswana, Angola. These are all nations in the southern half of Africa. I don't like saying Southern Africa because it sounds like Union of South Africa. I hate the name South Africa. It's a terrible name.
It is, and it's very confusing to most people.
They should call it Zululand.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the biggest tribe and most influential. But Zululand has all kinds of weird connotations. But anyway, the Rand refinery in South Africa is taking a lot of gold coming from what they call the distressed sectors, the distressed nations of Southern Africa. And they're refining it. Who's buying it? India and China.
Okay.
So the Rand refinery was brought into the picture by the BRICS nations. Remember when it was BRIC?
Yes.
Okay. Well, about 3 years ago, suddenly it's BRICS, and I wondered, what do they want South Africa for? What a crappy question that is.
Yeah.
I mean, all they're good for is, a few golfers and a good rugby team. I mean, what are they good for? And the voice answered back in sharp tones, slapping me down. Jim, the Rand refinery. And China can spark up all those gold mines that are being shut down and put in mothballs. I said, okay, the gold angle. But he said, not just mine, it's the refinery. It's one of the biggest in the world. Why is it one of the biggest in the world? Because in 1985, 40% of all the gold bars in the world came from South Africa.
Oh.
No, I don't mean that year. I mean up to 1985.
Okay.
40% of all the gold bars sitting above ground in vaults on Earth had their origin from South Africa. Union of South Africa. It's a very important refinery. And it's been, really the Swiss refineries are the most important, but as far as the emerging market nations go, there's nothing more important than the Rand refinery. When it comes to stealing gold in London and stealing it in Western European banks and recasting it, which means changing the serial numbers and putting them in kilogram form as opposed to ounce forms, the Swiss refineries are the most important, and they ship it to China. Most of it's going to China, but India gets quite a lot. It might be a very unexpected thing to hear from people listening, but the Indian households own somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 tons of gold.
Wow.
Okay, so who's behind the curve when it comes to gold?
Well, clearly we are. And England and France and the ones that are joined at the hip with us.
And not so much Canada. I'm told by Canadian clients that there are a lot of Canadians who own some gold coins, and probably not enough, but their attitude is different. If you ask someone like my brother said to me, my brother and father were on the phone with me. We had a three-way conversation. I said, Americans really need to do something about all the paper wealth they have. Mm-hmm. My dad said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, bank account money, stock money, mutual fund money, mm-hmm. Mutual fund money, just corporate bonds that are sitting, preferred stocks that are sitting, earning interest and dividends.
Retirement accounts
that are, sometimes tied up with property in a good, prudent way, like TIAA CREF, which my father has his retirement savings in. It's for professors in universities, but about 15 years ago they expanded to include research facilities. So it's academia and research foundations in TIAA CREF, and that's very, very well run. But the point is, I said to them, people need to get out of their paper wealth and to get into something more tangible. And my brother said, well, what is there? I said, John, you got a degree in economics. It's gold. What's wrong with you? You got a degree in law. You're on law review. Don't you even know that gold and silver are called money in the Constitution? And that's where the conversation broke down.
Right. That's where it would break down with many people.
Yes, with a lot of families. One of the most common emails I get from people is, wow, what you describe is just the same thing I have with my wife,
exactly.
with my brother, and I'm the only one in a family of four that thinks this way. Am I wrong or are they? And I said, no, they're wrong. And you can just, hit them with these 3 points, and what you'll get is blank stares. And one of them is very basic, Shelley, and we've covered it a lot. Is there something wrong with printing money to cover the U.S. government deficits and to buy bonds in an unsterilized form? We're calling it quantitative easing. Is there something wrong with that?
Oh, of course not. I mean, it's just pay attention. It's just a sluggish recovery.
Well, I'm talking about the money, Shelley, but...
Oh, I know, but it's still related to the perception that people have about it.
Yeah, right, where it's parallel point. But when I talk that way in specific terms about QE and whether something's wrong with that, what I get back from a comment, even from a well-educated person, is, well, of course it's a good idea. It's the Keynesian method. You cover the debts. You do what's necessary to keep the system going. And I say, well, what if the system's not worth preserving? Well, what are you talking about? Anarchy? I said, no, gold standard. Oh, that's kind of anarchy. I said, what we have now is anarchy. Gold standard is order. Gold standard prevents the fraud. Ron Paul, he's retired now from the Congress, but he did something in 07 and 08 that was very important, Shelley. What he did was they started the financial regulatory bill. And they had lots of different really good ideas, but then Citigroup and Goldman Sachs got their campaign donations to the Congressional Finance Committee.
Sure.
And Frank and Dodd, as it's known as the Frank-Dodd bill.
Dodd Act, yeah.
Dodd-Frank bill. I actually bumped into Barney Frank once. He was my representative when I was living in Newton Highlands, outside Boston. It's really Boston Metro, but anyway, I bumped into him and said, "Hey, Barney, what's going on? Good breadsticks, huh?" That's what I said to him. He was coming out of a bread shop. He's a portly fellow, and he's kind of cute. He's a gay boy, but not that really matters. But he got bought. So Ron Paul did something very important. But the Goldman Sachs and Citibank boys got their hooks in there and started making big campaign contributions. And what I'd like to know is, how much money did you get, Barney Frank? And how much did you report? But that's not my business. It's for the tax boys if they ever want to pursue that. But here's how it worked out. Ron Paul wanted to do lots of different things to ban derivative trading to get rid of the big banks from being involved with stocks and bonds and a lot of different things. They call it private portfolio trading. So there were some limits put in there. But by the time Dodd-Frank got bribed sufficiently with millions from Wall Street, the financial regulatory bill did not look anything like its original form.
What a surprise.
Not a surprise at all. But they threw Ron Paul a bone. The bone had two parts. The first part was to limit the portfolio trading for stocks and bonds by the different Wall Street banks. The second thing was, and Ron Paul was adamant about this, he wanted an independent audit of the Federal Reserve's books.
Right.
He got it, and in 2009 they published the results. There were, in two waves, tranches, there were $23 trillion in near 0% loans to the 8 families or 9 families that own the Federal Reserve. 23 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, that is equal to the entire U.S. housing market nationwide, and might include some commercial property. Not sure. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I remember hearing way back that it's 18 trillion for the U.S. housing stock. No, it's 20 or 21. And there was a lot of debate in there when they were dealing with the subprime bond and their explosion that pretty much wrecked the global financial system. And we still haven't recovered because we haven't done anything toward remedy. So Ron Paul won the bone, which exposed how the Fed has given. They're never going to be repaid for these near 0% loans of $23 trillion.
Of course not.
It was a loan to the owners so they could buy up the world's assets when everything breaks down like now.
Yeah.
This is so ugly. So the gold standard would prevent that. They couldn't give out a $23 trillion set of loans to all the owners on the board of the Federal Reserve. They couldn't do that. So what's chaos? The gold standard or what we have now? I contend what we have now is true chaos.
Absolutely.
And I made a forecast way back in 2005 and 2004 when I started the newsletter. I said eventually when you have more systemic breakdown, they're going to defend the dollar with war in an open way.
And that's clearly what we're seeing every single day.
Yes, ma'am. I think Ukraine was disguised, but that's to defend the dollar by disrupting a Russian-European marriage. Mm-hmm. And now I'm hearing, I don't want to mention my source. A lot of people pay me a left-handed compliment. You can buy the Hattrick letter and get access to all Jim's sources. I have a lot of good analysis that forecasted the Lehman Brothers failure without any sources at all and built up a business of almost 2,000 subscribers without any sources at all. Okay, so now I've got some sources and the newsletter's all sorted. No, there's analysis that's aided by really wonderful sources and a team of colleagues that I really didn't have back in 2007 and 2008. I built my team of colleagues. There's about 8 or 9 guys. They're mostly Americans, but they're not all Americans. We come from various walks. But anyway, that's where we are right now, Shelley. And the gold standard is order.
Right.
And it's equitable rules. And here's the rule that's going to slam the U.S. If you don't make anything, you don't eat.
Yep, and since all our industry is somewhere else.
We do have some industry. It's just not a critical mass. Mm-hmm. And in the last 4 or 5 years, this is really sad. The bulk of the new American industries, like little copper tubing shop in Alabama, they're owned by China. They're owned by Chinese. They're given various states on a loan because if you start up this copper tube mill and foundry, you can hire 150 people, and it's good for jobs. So the state aids the Chinese capital formation.
Yeah.
We've lost our ability to understand money and capital. So the U.S. is going to come back, but it's going to come back under foreign ownership, which we will eventually call carpetbaggers.
Yes.
But when they start opening up the Chinese banks and they have a more favorable interest rate to buy a car or a home, they're not going to be given the nasty label of carpetbaggers. And when it comes to buying a car and being given a loan, I mean, forget the, $2,000 credit on your price and, okay, fine, you got a 0%. What's the price of the car?
Right.
It's still up there. So even your cost with principal payments, it's up there. And some of the percentages are not exactly rosy when you get outside the car sector. The car sector is special. I don't know exactly why. I remember Kurt Rickenbacker way back in 2004 told me, 2003, before I had the newsletter, he invited me to the French Riviera to spend a week with him. He was the foremost Austrian School of Economics spokesman and writer. He said, Jim, there are two industries that a country cannot afford to lose. One is steel and the other is transportation, meaning buses, trucks, and cars.
Sure.
Railroads, rail cars, locomotives. And the U.S., when we outsourced industry and had trouble with all the environmental controls and emissions and rules and regs, we lost some of our steel industry. And having lost the car industry is well known. Take a look on inside a lot of American-made cars and you see foreign parts.
Yes.
Chrysler, you even see Mitsubishi engines. So,
mm-hmm.
We're going to come back, but we're going. Okay, here's the big rub. The U.S. is going to get slammed. We're not going to be able to give foreign fabricators, foreign suppliers. We're not going to be able to give them treasury bills soon. They're going to say no, we don't want them,
right.
And that could be the process that's underway right now with the stalled shipping. This could be a global strike against the dollar for its payment monopoly on the shipments.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
I'm up with a new dollar, and I'm calling it the Scheiss dollar. The Scheiss dollar. Scheiss is German for excrement, but not exclusively. It's for refuse. Like, there's a lot of Scheiss sitting over there in the field. It's just a bunch of garbage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I prefer. Some say, "Don't you really mean shit dollar, Jim?" No, it's the Scheiss dollar. We're going to issue a Scheiss dollar, and it's going to be. The Chinese have demanded that it be devalued by 50%, which means all imports would cost double.
Double, right.
For the Americans. Now look at all the different things we depend on from foreign suppliers. All would cost double. If half the economy is that, then you're going to see a 50% price inflation. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not going to go over very well. Now, the Chinese have said 50%. The U.S. government officials, so I'm told, and I believe this, I'm told that the U.S. government official at Treasury made a compromise with the Chinese, who are really calling a lot of shots and own the controlling interest of the Federal Reserve. The Chinese were given a compromise. How about two 30% devaluations? Pretty much like what Venezuela had.
Okay.
They had, I think, a 41 and a 32. I know the total was 73%.
Okay.
Okay, here's how you do your calculations. And one of my clients sent this to me, Jim. He said, looks like you're struggling, but here's a simple way of doing it. If you have a 30% dollar devaluation, you're holding 70%.
Right.
Okay. So what's 1 over 0.7? That's a 43%, 42%, 41% inflation. Okay,
right.
If you do two consecutive 30% devaluations, you hold 70%, then you hold 70% more. That's 49%. Bingo, there's your 50. It's a 1% devaluation if they do 2 straight 30% devals. That's what's coming. And it's not going to be successful. I shouldn't say that. It's not going to be sufficient because it's not going to balance the federal budget. It's not going to balance the trade deficit. You need more time. Mm-hmm. You need more industry to be rooted. You need more foreign capitalists, venture capitalists to come in with cooperation, with tax breaks, with rosy loan features, like, the first 3 years, cut that percentage rate in half, in order to create jobs, in order to create exportable goods. And by the way, all these Chinese little factories and farms, they've got a rule. 1/3 of the output goes to China. This is how you get shortages, Shelley.
Yes.
We're going to be in a desperate mode to close the trade deficit. And the federal deficit is going to be a little bit easier because they're going to cut back on Social Security. They're going to cut back on aid to dependent children. They're going to cut back on welfare. They're going to cut back on everything.
Yeah, and they're going to loot people's bank accounts and take their security or their pension funds and their 401ks and everything else because, they're going to be digging through the couch cushions at that point.
Yeah, I think they're going to do something a lot bigger and a lot bolder and actually a lot more effective, but in a fascist way. They're going to say that all the pension funds in the United States must be to support the Treasury bond.
Yes.
And poof, there's your $1 trillion right there. So we can balance the budget by forced national pension fund contributions to the U.S. government that will suffer immediately in the devaluations.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's but the U.S. is going to lose it. I ask, this probably happens 10 or 12 times a year. I talk with someone like at a sports bar. Sports bars are a wonderful place for me to mingle. I meet people. I meet sweet Latinas. I make them sometimes an offer they can't refuse because I'm such a charmer. No, I'm not. I don't know if I'm charmer, but I meet other gringos. We call them gringos. The origin of gringo, by the way, is they had green uniforms on Latin American soil, killing natives, and the natives would have demonstrations. Green, go home.
Oh, for heaven's sake!
Green uniforms. Green go home. Green go home. Green go home. Gringo.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot of weird colloquialisms like that, but they do adopt the word Yankee. They just spell it Yanqui. Okay, so it's going to be weird. It's going to be ugly, and I think we're going to see a lot of very deep disruptions.
I'm sure we will.
This is going to really need a 3-year economic program. And we need better leaders because there's not a single leader out there who's free of the campaign contributions or free of the Rockefeller, Rothschild, Clinton crime families.
Exactly.
Right now, one of the biggest jokes in the world that Hillary is running for president. And let me explain something that they're doing regarding Hillary for her support. I had an email given to me from a Texas-based client and said, Hillary just got off a train in my town. It's not a small town. It's a mid-sized city in Texas, and there were 7 people to greet her. Her staff of bodyguards and campaign managers was 15 strong, bigger than the public crowd to greet her. But take a look at some of the national polls, and you see 20%, 25, 30%. It's all a lie by a factor of 10.
At least, yes.
All the polls lie about Hillary and Jeb Bush on the other side. Mm-hmm. Jeb Bush is suffering from a very unique problem right now. The Bush crime family is having their narcotics lines with Saudi Arabia interrupted. So the Bush family is less an investor in the U.S. stocks. Can you say the stocks are falling? We're not talking about small amounts of money here. We're talking about like $100 billion a year just through the Saudi connection. Afghanistan is responsible for $800 billion of narco money per year. Most of it goes through Wall Street banks, but some of it goes through London banks. It also goes through Deutsche Bank.
Oh, go figure.
And it all goes through Incirlik base in Turkey. So you think they're going to hang on to Turkey? So anyway, I got off the track here. But Hillary is a joke. And Hillary is really an important, I call her an ombudsman, but that's masculine, ombudswoman. She's an agent for a crime family.
Yes, she is.
I mean, she took charge as soon as Bill Clinton was president. And the first order of business they had to do was to make sure that the global funds that were not stolen, but hijacked by Rubin, Paulson, Papa Bush, and then Clinton, they had to make sure that the Swiss bankers got their cut. And it wasn't stolen. It's $2 trillion of global funds. Now just do some simple math and assume for argument's sake that it pays 5% interest per year, which it could if it's a mix of treasury bonds and shorter term bonds and European bonds and British gilts and whatever. Okay, 5% is $100 billion stolen per year. Okay, they had to go make some payments to the Swiss masters who were behind some of this in Basel, Switzerland. And a fellow named Vincent Foster said, no!
Oh, boy. Yeah, you don't say no to the Clinton-Bush cabal, that's for sure.
So he ended up with the suicide. I love the verb, he was suicided.
So do I. It's perfect.
Well, there might be some more pretty soon because some big names are going to fall. And rather than have 6 people come forward or 20 come forward to testify against Hillary in treason, sedition, and influence peddling with the Clinton Foundation, what you might see is 20 people suddenly dying. This is how the crime families work. And if you think that this Rothschild guy is a sweetheart in his 90s, no, he hired the Bush crime family to take down the second Malaysian airliner that was loaded with engineers from, oh gosh, what's the name of it? I got it. Freescale. Freescale chip. Freescale was a company that made the best anti-hacking chip. It was like multi-processor with embedding systems. That's a technical term. I don't wish to explain it. Just has a lot of moving parts that react. Freescale was the world's best, and Jacob Rothschild wanted it. So he murdered 230 people on a passenger plane so that the survivors who own shares at Freescale would be intimidated to sell it to him. So he had a no-bid purchase of the company for $13 billion.
Wow.
That's Jacob Rothschild, who, by the way, kind of put together the plans for the Ukraine war.
Oh, I'm sure.
And his grandfather, another Rothschild, I don't have all the names. I think Baron was his name. Can't remember.
Baron von Rothschild.
His grandfather made a deal with the Tsar of Russia. We want to borrow your gold. And I'm just going to make up a figure because there was a lot of gold. I'm thinking it was like 15,000 tons of gold.
Okay.
I'm guessing. It could have been 20, could have been 13. I don't know. It's something on that order. And they were told, the Tsar was told, look, you've got rebellion brewing in your country. Well, Rothschild should know he was paying for the Bolshevik Revolution.
Exactly.
He was a designer of it. He was hiring Trotsky. Okay, so they said, we want to borrow your gold for safekeeping. We're going to put it in New York, London, and Paris. And a matter of months later, he was murdered.
Go figure.
So would you say perhaps the Bolshevik Revolution was a gold heist?
Absolutely.
In a sense, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great quote by Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago.
Yep.
I was shocked to read this, but Solzhenitsyn said that the main people running the Communist Party at the tip top were not Russian. They were Europeans.
That's just the way it always works. The big hands in the background that you don't see because they're busy manipulating their puppets.
We call them cutouts.
Mm-hmm.
So Khrushchev, Kosygin, Brezhnev, even Gorbachev, they were cutouts.
Yeah. They
were taking orders. They were given tremendous privileges and dachas. Dacha is just a mountain or a lakeside house, a getaway. Here they call them haciendas. H is silent in Spanish. Hacienda. Yes. I have an hacienda in the selva, in the woods. Okay, so Rothschild, he was a very busy guy, the grandfather of Jacob Rothschild, who's in his 90s now. Mm-hmm. And these guys are all taking stem cells, so they're living beyond their normal allotted years. And Papa Bush just had hip replacement and knee replacement, and too bad he can't get his heart replaced so that it's something more humane, not human, but humane. And the funniest one of all is Dick Cheney. He doesn't have a heart.
No, he doesn't.
Had a mechanical device in there. So you can't accuse him of not having a human heart. He doesn't have a human heart. He doesn't. Anyway, so it's kind of funny. Some things are kind of funny and some things are kind of tragic, but I like to try to find some silver lining and good side. There is a lot of hope. People they're running out of time. I said this at Christmas. I said this in November. I said this in October. The Federal Reserve and Wall Street is propping up the stock market. Mm-hmm. So why not sell to them at these artificially high prices? And why not buy gold and silver that they're keeping artificially low?
Agreed.
Sell your stocks, sell your bonds, sell your mutual funds, buy gold and silver. Keep it outside of the country. It makes perfect sense, and some people are signing up for the newsletter, the Hat-Trick Letter, found on goldenjackass.com, and telling me exactly that they've done that. And it's not a lot of people. I mean, there are a lot of people signing up, but it's only like 20 or 25 people have told me in the last several months. I bought a bunch of gold and silver, and I sold a lot of stock, but I want to be careful not to sell too much. Okay, they don't get it. They don't get it. Sell it all.
They're just hedging their bets that you're wrong, but, whatever.
Oh, God, other clients would tell me, really, shouldn't you have no more than 10% in precious metals? I said, no, you've got 90% in paper. And they said, what do you mean by that? I said, what is your 90%? Stocks, mutual funds, bonds, bank CDs? He said, yeah. I said, that's paper. You're 90% paper and 10% physical. And they said, oh, I see what you mean. I need more tangible assets. Does farmland qualify? I say, yes, it qualifies.
Yeah.
Okay, so people need to get out of their stocks and bonds and bank CDs. If they got, it could be that if they got CDs that are under 100,000, they might not have anything confiscated with the bail-ins. I don't know. They might lower it just to help out the bank. Suddenly at 50,000 by a bill that was put through Congress on some war appropriations bill. Mm-hmm. In Clause 32, you didn't notice, they dropped the bail-in from 100 to 50,000 or to 20,000 just to make sure that you're a pauper.
Absolutely.
This is how it works. We don't have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have a government. This was actually a study recently done. Oh gosh, was it Harvard or was it the the Wharton School of Business, or one of the business schools, actually looked at the nature of legislation and made a decision. Is this pro-people or is it pro-corporation? And they decided that something like 88% of all the legislation from the U.S. Congress benefited the corporations and not the people.
Of course it does.
So we don't have a government of the people. We don't have a democracy. We need to get rid of the campaign donations. I mean, why should a bank be in a position to donate to the House Committee on Finance to write the financial regulatory bill? The bank is writing its own bill.
Of course they are, because it's this incestuous revolving door that happens between quote-unquote government service and the banksters.
Absolutely. So we're not going to really get out of this without some level of chaos. And I've been saying this now for 5 years. Mm-hmm. When the dollar goes, and most Americans don't even know what that means.
No, they
don't.
What
do you mean the dollar goes? Are you aware, Joe, over his beer, Joe, are you aware that the dollar is used in international trade for payments on ships? What the contents of shipping? No, I didn't know that. I know it's the currency for the United States. Congratulations. You're just way ahead of the curve, Joe.
Oh, definitely.
Are you aware, Joe, that banks around the world hold treasury bonds as their foundation? No, I didn't know what they held. Congratulations, Joe. You're way behind the curve. Most people don't know what the dollar is.
You're right. That's absolutely right.
It's a global reserve currency, and as a result of wars, deficits, and monetary policy with QE, we're going to lose the dollar's status and role as the currency for the reserve purpose, the reserve currency. The currency used in reserves purposes. The currency used primarily in banking reserves. Right. The Forex reserve. Take Korea, for instance. They probably have 70% of their banking reserves or more in treasury bonds. They're going to get rid of them.
Of course they are.
Okay. And when the U.S. it's going to Well, that's okay. We were on that, but I pretty much said my piece.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure that people know that we had an accidental Skype crash, and let's just tell the audience right now, Jim, what you suggest people to do.
Okay, you go ahead. You make the little transition for a cutout.
Okay, I basically just did. So go ahead and let us know where we were in terms of what to do.
Okay. Well, I had mentioned the motivations and the justification and the rationale for getting out of paper wealth, because when the new dollar comes in, all the paper wealth is going to be devalued. So it's like, overnight your whatever you've got in the bank is worth 30% less because of the dollar being devalued so heavily. And it's not going to be one devaluation. I think we're going to have a series of about 5. And the new dollar could in several years, a few years even, it could be 70% in devaluation. It could be 80%. Mm-hmm. You can't just say, well, we're Americans, we'll never tolerate that. No, it doesn't work that way. When you lose the global reserve currency status, you've got to stand on your own. And the deficits for the United States are $1 trillion for the federal and $500 billion a year for trade. That deficit has to be closed on both sides, federal and trade, in order to bring balance. There is no balance in the current system. We must achieve it. And if you want to see an example of chaos, look to Venezuela. They had a 74% devaluation in 1 year back in 2013, and I think they've had additional, and now they have shortages in Venezuela for rice, beans, toilet paper, and condoms. They're exporting everything that's not nailed down. And why? To close the trade deficit.
Exactly.
And the U.S. is going to be put in that same isolated situation of having to close the deficit. And what they're going to do, I think, in Washington and Wall Street and capitals across the 50 states is to invite foreign capital.
I'm sure they will.
Start new businesses, and they will boast of an educated, trained, and hardworking group of people, the workforce. Okay, but what do you do to save your skin? Get out of the paper wealth and buy gold and silver bars and coins. The U.S. Mint has radically increased its allotment for January for gold and silver coins, and I applaud them. They're finally obeying the law. You can't say we're going to ration. The Constitution says you must produce what's demanded.
Right.
And we're going to break the gold and silver corrupt pricing regime. I think we're going to see COMEX just no longer sell futures contracts. They're just going to be a cash and carry arena. But that's coming in the future. We got many steps to pass, but 2016 is going to be a tumultuous year.
Yes, indeed.
For paper markets, stocks, and bonds. We're probably going to see, Shelley, a bond market rally in treasuries. We're probably going to see a move toward 1% on the 10-year bond. I call it the black hole. What do you do when your wealth in paper is at risk? You put it into the safe place.
Sure.
The Treasury bond. And who's supporting the Treasury bond but the Department of Treasury, with the second barrel following up the Federal Reserve?
Yep, the ESF.
So you're going to see, I think, a big rally, and I put it in the January newsletter, the forecast of a rally to 1%. And
besides getting your physical assets in place, make sure that includes, like you just said, rice, beans, toilet paper, anything that you can trade with somebody else who might need it, like cigarettes or alcohol, if they're in an addictive situation, whatever we have to do to be able to get ourselves self-responsible and working amongst each other.
I'll tell you what 3 things I store.
What's that?
Water.
Right, water, definitely.
Frijoli beans. It's a kind of a whipped up brown bean, black bean, in a can. That's the second. And the third thing is tuna.
Interesting.
Tuna in cans. One of the real pleasures of life once in a while, we had a water shutdown here. And I had a friend over, and we had some fun. And when it was all over, she said to me, "Jim, I can't take a shower." I said, "Oh, yes, you can, my dear. I've got 2-liter bottles of water." It was one of the finest pleasures I've ever had, watching a woman take a shower without the nozzle working. It was from the 2-liter jug of water.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank God for small miracles, right?
Oh, thank God for small pleasures.
There you go. That's even better. All right. You think we've covered what needs to be covered, so people are adequately warned?
Well, I think adequately is a strong word. I think we covered 10% of what needs to be covered, but this is certainly a good start, and I hope to be back on your show sometime in the future. But we've covered a lot of things, and I'm getting tired. My voice is getting...
Yes, I can tell.
Sometimes I notice that my voice is almost moving to the falsetto.
Yes.
That's my sign that I'm done.
That you're worn out. Well, I'm so appreciative because, there's going to be a lot of people that don't have even some of the basic things that you have covered today. And you're another voice of reality and sanity out there that I really, really appreciate. So much gratitude. I would like people to please go visit your website, goldenjackass.com, and sign up for your newsletter. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch with you and having you back as soon as possible.
Well, it'll be a pleasure to come back, and I I urge people to check the website out, not so much to sign up for the newsletter, but there's a lot of free material on it.
Yes, there is. Plenty of links, prior interviews, etc.
And public articles. I try to do one a month. Honestly, Shelley, in the first 6 years of the newsletter, I did one almost every week.
That's wonderful.
But I was building the newsletter, and I was very energetic, and now I'm, if I had two choices, one is to do an hour interview, or the other is to do spend 2.5 hours writing a public article. I'd much rather do an interview.
Sure, and we can preserve it the same way, and get it out there. So,
and people, I have people send me messages. It's really kind of funny. They say, Jim, I do a 45-minute walk through a nature trail, or another person would say, I walk the beach in Carolina, and I download your whole interview and I listen to it while I'm doing my exercise.
That's the way to do it.
So you can't read an article like that. So
that's right. That's why I like audio for a number of reasons.
And some people listen to it while they're on their way to work or on their way home from work, commuting. Mm-hmm. So it's fun. I tell you, this is a labor of love. I never thought I'd enjoy this so much, but now it's getting to the point where the time has come for a resolution. We have been dicking around. We've now done away with the too big to fail bank policy. The Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, has come out already. This was last month. There will be no more giant bailouts for a failed New York bank.
Yes, I saw that. So
that means the Chinese told the Fed that they're not going to bail out Wall Street anymore.
Exactly.
The Chinese do not regard Wall Street as anything remotely their ally. Well, they're playing games with the Chinese bonds and Chinese stock market. When the Chinese stock market takes a tumble, usually it's Wall Street that triggers it. So there's a lot of financial espionage going on.
Absolutely.
We need some resolution, Shelley, and I'm getting tired of this. I'd like to see things done in 2 years. Gold standard back, and I'd struggle to see what's left for the newsletter, but we're not there. We don't have the gold standard in there. We don't have several gold currencies at work. And one of the interesting questions I get is, if you got 7 different gold currencies, how do they differ? Well, there are plenty of ways that they differ, and I try to cover this in the newsletter, but the percentage that you can redeem for gold, it could differ. That's called the cover clause. Mm-hmm. They might have different government bonds interlaced with them with different interest rates. The Chinese offer a higher interest rate than the treasury bonds for the U.S. government. The U.S. government does not compete well with anything.
No, of course they don't.
So,
all right.
Anyway, it's good being on. Thanks for having me, and maybe we'll be talking in the future.
All right. Take good care, Jim. Take care of your voice.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.